Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this week's episode, writer Erik Davis discusses his influential book TechGnosis, which explores the intersection of myth, spirituality, and the occult in the digital age.
TechGnosis is not a theory of progress. It recognizes that technology is driven partly by a mythology of progress, and that while there are technological improvements and those things change, the idea that this is part of a larger sort of evolution in consciousness is, for me, an interesting idea to understand, not to promulgate so much. So one of the things I was doing with that book is to sort of peel off the secular layers of technology and get at the myths that are animating them, some of which are clear, some of which are obscure, and some of which are quite contradictory. One of my chapters does deal with the idea of progress, and that we're building, and this was again the 1990s, so we're building a planetary mind, and this is going to unify people. This is the idea that a lot of people were ascribing to, and by the way, make a lot of people a lot of money. But we're staging this emergence of a planetary consciousness, but then at the same time I recognize that this was also a kind of a paranoid's dream or nightmare of control and manipulation and a kind of satanic demiurgic world that was going to control everybody. And so I saw both of those kind of at the same time, and I think one of the reasons that people still get a lot out of TechGnosis, even though it's about technology and it's 25 years old, 26 years old, is because I was doing that kind of deep mythological understory work, and that those things are still here. They're still with us. Maybe some of them are darker than they were in the 1990s, but even then I could see that side of things, the kind of dark side of progress. Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested with that term and that idea. What does it refer to? And the way that I'm using it in the book is to talk about this sort of tendency to sort of drop the body, leave the material world, and kind of ascend into some sort of higher dimension. And in religion, you could say that the Gnostics were kind of like that. People have different accounts of them. In a way, they're just more extreme Christians. But the idea of technosis, of that technology is going to be a vehicle for some kind of radical transcendence, is obviously still very, very much with us. So I was kind of pulling out the kind of psychological, mythical backstory of our desire to translate ourselves into a kind of emerging digital reality, that I think that it's partly satisfying much older dreams and desires about transcendence, which I think are deeply problematic. The idea of we're going to escape the body, we're going to escape nature, we're going to escape history, that all of those ideas, which are still compelling, need to be historicized and kind of broken apart. I think part of the trick of technology is that and I very much developed the idea in the book that technology is a kind of trickster, is that because it uses science and rationality, because it uses laws of physics and information, that it has a kind of neutral appearance. It seems as if it's part of our secular world. But why these technologies get developed, why they get marketed the way they are, why they are embraced with such passion and sometimes such terror, has to do with much deeper things that we're not as aware of. So it's easy for technology to kind of give us a secular progress vision that we can, use to organize the meaning of our lives. And at the same time, we're buying into all these other stories that we're not necessarily as aware of. So you have to go hunting for them. You have to look in popular culture. You have to look in video games. You have to look in drug worlds, in science fiction, in order to find the more nuanced and sometimes much more shadowy dimensions of this sort of technological religion, essentially, that secular modernity has given us. One of the most fun chapters I had researching was about this question: why is there so much magic in video games? Why wizards? Why magical powers? Why magical weapons? Where does this come from? And so I went through a history of the occult and the relationship of the occult to technology and the emergence of fantasy fiction, and just showing how very different ideas about what technology was, or what digital technology, what computer technology was about, were being told through the metaphors, these sort of active metaphors of magic, which in some ways still is one of the best analogies for what we're doing with computer code. You're basically taking language and making things happen in the world. And now, as computer code gets integrated with so much manufacturing, it really is like developing new objects with just a thought and just a vision. So in a way, part of the intense weirdness of modernity in general, this sort of like endless production of new objects that turn around and change us and change the way the world is in a way a Faustian bargain. And by looking at these metaphors embedded in video games and in fantasy fiction, you actually can sort of tap into what's really going on with a lot of technology in a more global way that has to do with the sort of the ambivalence of the trickster, the ambivalence of the Faustian pact. If we're sticking to either the idea that technology is manifesting ideas and visions that were seeded long, long ago, including ideas of transcendence or the ideas of a kind of immaterial world, or if we're just paying attention to Marx, who's talking about the way that in modernity, all that's solid melts into air, and that there's something inherent about how capitalism colonizes spaces of life and transforms them, that you got capitalism on one side and you have increasingly powerful technologies on the other hand that have a kind of, I don't want to say inherent decorporealization, but certainly in our culture they've gone in that way, that you're driving to a place where the incorporeal is actually kind of part of the technology. And that can seem both like a proof that we are actually these mystical beings, but more rationally and more critically, they sort of feed off of that fantasy of being free. So like the idea of the cloud. Oh, well, where do you keep your data? Well, I keep my data in the cloud. What cloud? No, you keep your data in somebody else's computer, which, by the way, is sucking an extraordinary amount of energy out of the whole system, and therefore is dependent on all these physical systems. So we're not transcending the planet at all, but we have a concept about it. Oh, it's just in the cloud. Oh, it's just in these sort of incorporeal messages. And so part of the critical work is to always remember and remind that we are also embedded at the same time. And in fact, that embedding is really where a lot of the action and a lot of the fear and a lot of what's going to determine our future is really happening. And yet we're still kind of caught up in this kind of fantasy of decorporealization, which does have a certain factor to it, because consciousness itself has that kind of immaterial character, even if you're not mystical about it. There's a way in which our sense of being alive and awake in this moment right now has a kind of intangible quality. And technology is marching closer and closer and on more finer and finer scales to being able to engage and manipulate with us on that level. So the idea of Neuralink, the idea of kind of hacking directly into the brain such that consciousness itself now hosts the algorithm, is kind of an end point or a bifurcation point that lies just a little bit ahead of where we're at, and it's kind of inevitable in the sense that the karma of what we've released is going to drive this situation, whether we want it or not, because there is this desire, I think, to enter into that incorporeal space with these technologies, even if most of us don't really want to go there. It's going to happen on some level. I really don't know what happens with the kind of genuinely post-human. I mean, it feels like we're at the edge of a point where there's more and more choice and selection, at least among the people who have the power, of the degree to which we kind of leave aside some of the traditional frameworks of being a human being. And I think Neuralink is like a really good example of that. You've made your pact at that point. And I think also there will be a point where you get a lot of resistance. And I expect that part of our future, that part of the right-wing populism that we see is actually in relationship to a fear around post-humanism. And we don't understand that enough. We understandably look at it in terms of racism predominantly, but I think part of it is also a fear of the post-human. It's easier to understand why forces on the right embrace mysticism, in part because they have an element or a fantasy of tradition. So they have an idea and an investment in zones of culture that are pre-modern. You know, so if you're like resistant to modernity, you can be resistant to it in a progressive or anarchic way, but you can also be resistant to it in a conservative or reactionary way, and then you're looking back to the past, and then the past becomes imbued with these deeper forces, you know, some of which make sense to me. I mean, I can understand why there are traditional practices that get lost as we force everybody into modernity, and that there's a tremendous longing and nostalgia for those for some good reasons. And so it makes sense to me that there are aspects of the right that have that kind of dimension alongside, you know, Christianity and you know, Orthodox Christianity. I do think it's important for forces on the left, or the progressive forces, to be open to modes of mysticism and magic, and that the idea that some kind of secular idea is going to suffice to deal with the complexity of our future, I think is very naive, and that in some sense everybody has to get their esoteric game on to a certain degree just to be able to understand the signs and symbols and experiences and altered states that are increasingly part of the fractious, you know, sort of consensus reality that we're still holding on to some degree. And so it's important to do that from more politically progressive points of view as well.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.